I'm actually going to do a lot on the fly up here today, and I'll tell you why. Right after I thank you for having me. Matt reached out to me, and this started as a book talk, and then he said, no, I think we've got people doing some really fascinating work, and it would be great if we were in conversation with each other. And I think it was a wonderful idea. For many reasons. One, I tend to like to do events where I also learn a great deal, and this is one of those events. And so it makes it very valuable for me, but also because generally by the time I do my talk, I usually have to set people up with the idea of what we mean by credentials, how we think about them, and what kind of work they do in our society. It is a real treat for me to not have to do probably quite so much of that work with the folks in this room. Because of that, what you're about to see happen in real time is me rewrite my talk. So that is both a warning and a notice. We will see how that goes. Mostly because when you have an opportunity to, it's like my friends who teach race. There's a joke among race scholars that we do so much work having to teach race 101, we never get to 202. So it is not very often that I get to skip ahead to like a 300 or 400 level class to talk to people about some of the more, what I think are interesting complexities in this work. And so I'm sorry, I've got to take advantage of that. So that means if you see me go back and forth a little bit here, that's what's happening up front. And I will also tell you that I try to keep us on time and to leave plenty of time for Q&A. My experience of doing this work is that there are always lots of questions. And you should feel free to jump in with those as I'm going through the presentation. I don't stand on a whole lot of formality. I'm from the US South. I'm really comfortable with call and response. If you are comfortable with me saying on occasion, can you hold that for a second, because we're going to get to it a little later. So if that's our shared agreement, I'm fine with that. And I don't think that'd be a problem with this group. Sometimes it's a problem with some economists, and so I have to say. But it looked like we had some really nice economists here today, and I want to point that out. Thank you very much for that. The structure of the talk is generally, I'll start with how the book came about, how it emerges out of my dissertation research, and then some additional research. I'd like to talk about some of the connections in the earlier conversations, particularly around internships as a form perhaps of a quasi-credential, which I think is interesting to think about. And then some questions that came up in our last panel about race, class, and gender inequalities. I was very excited to see some of that work about gender and for the question to come up about race and class. Obviously, I'm a sociologist. I think about race, class, and gender a lot. As a disciplinary imperative, but then also as a personal commitment. That's fundamentally what I was interested in. So while my work has been on for-profit colleges, as I told some of the students earlier today, as a sociologist, what I was really interested in was the social process that had produced the consequences for what I call high-risk credentials in the new economy. Right? So I'm interested in the process. So one of the things, after I kind of give some background on the book and the study, that I would like to talk about is the underlying processes and what I think some of the lessons are as we think about things like other forms of credentialing, right? So we've had, so far today, we've talked about the differences between internships and apprenticeships. We have heard about credentials, and if you are in that market, you probably hear things like micro credentials, right? Mini credentials, stackable credentials. We now have credentials that do everything but dance, sing and dance, right? So we've got this whole plethora, and I think that is a consequence of the lessons from the social processes that produce the for-profit college phenomenon. So that's my, me giving away the big talk. Okay, so I'm a sociologist. I always think it's important to locate myself in the work, but if you have read the book, and let's just all pretend people have, thank you. Thank you to everyone who has assigned it. I really appreciate that. I'm not only a sociologist who was coming at this with an academic interest, I had a personal interest in the subject matter, right? This might be interesting for some of the students in the room. I now tell my graduate students all the time, the most important work that you can do is the work that only you could have done. Right? That may make it harder for you to do that work, but I think that makes it all the more valuable. I had this particular experience working in for-profit colleges when I went to graduate school that I never wanted to leverage in my graduate research. I, in fact, didn't even talk about the experience for the first 3 years that I was in graduate school. I did not want to call on my quote-unquote lived experience in doing my research for all of the reasons perhaps that might be familiar to some of you in the room, right? It comes with a lot of political baggage. baggage. I will tell you this, it was not until I embraced the marriage between my lived experience and my empirical research that I think I even got close to the project that you see reflected in lower ed. So what lower ed is, it is a combination of my empirical research about what was happening in the for-profit college sector in what the time frame that I call the new economy, of course drawing on the new economy literature. That's really this time period that people like Matthias and others were talking about earlier. We had entered into this period by the end of the 1980s, certainly by 1994, which is when I anchor all of my work, from 1994 to 2015, where a specific set of conditions were said to be universally true of the labor market. Now, whether that was empirically true or not, that's not where I started my conversation. What I was really interested in initially was the ideology that had legitimized how people were going to work and go to college under these economic conditions, right? That's what I was interested in. Almost immediately, what I'm confronted with is this idea of the skills gap. Right? It was driving everything in my research. So I had to start with sort of the ideology of what was the skills gap and what was embedded in it. I think Laura said on the panel earlier, it really sort of papers over a lot of social and political processes and tries to make those processes sound like technical problems. Right? So my main takeaway to start this research was the skills gap was not an empirical problem, right? It was a political problem that had been dressed up as a technical problem. Once you say something is a skills gap, you can talk about information asymmetries, right? You can talk about all these things without ever having to address the underlying politics, right? So that's where my conversation started. So then I had some additional questions then. So if the skills gap was, as I have argued, was ascendant, right? It sort of, as Matthias pointed out earlier, didn't even really seem to exist before like Reagan, right? And by the end of sort of Reagan's term, we've got people starting to use it. It really starts to pick up really under Clinton's term, quite frankly, is when it starts to permeate, by the way, federal education policy. This is a gift from Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton's administration, the skills gap, as is some of the roots of the for-profit college phenomenon, as luck would have it, right? So I started to figure out, well, how have we thought about these issues, right? So as good people do, as we started out with our first panel, we did a literature review, right? And I actually want to focus on this not so much about what the literature was saying, but to talk about what happens when a socio-political process becomes a technical problem, right? Because we were thinking of all of the research through the lens of the skills gap, all of the research was taking for granted the assumption that it was a technical problem and therefore reinforcing the skills gap as a technical problem. So as a social scientist, I knew that we understood credentials to be many things, right? Credentials can be a proxy for what you know. Credentials can be a signal for what you are, right? That goes back to our cultural capital question, right? Credentials can be a form of access and gatekeeping, right? It is a form of routinization and bureaucracy, right? If you want to get really critical, it's a form of authority and control. The real critical sociologists in the room, okay. All right, so we had this really complex way of talking about credentials in the literature that had this really long history. So what one may have expected when you started your literature review or started thinking about, okay, then what are for-profit college credentials, right? What are they? When really my real question is, why are they? But we had to start with what are they first, right? So the question is, what are they? You maybe would have expected that you would have had all these different perspectives in the literature thinking about these problems. These perspectives can be boiled down usually to these three ways of thinking about it. Our rational choice theories probably are very familiar to those of us in the room, right? So this is the idea that credentials represent skills, right? That's even how we use them in our models. And in fact, if credentials no longer represent skills the way we think they are, we've really got an empirical problem. That's a whole other thing, maybe for another conversation later. Then we had this understanding, the neo-institutional theories, which was to think about these things as organizations, right? Higher education institutions as organizations. So what happens when these complex organizations are trying to do this complex thing, like produce people who have credentials? 78% of the literature on for-profit colleges were coming from these two theories, right? Credentialing, however, was the critical framework. Credentialing said that credentials are actually a form of a social coupon, is one way to think of it, right? That represents an exchange of some sort that is not just about what skills you are, but it also includes all of these other things that we tend to care a lot about. Right? It tends to be the messy place where things like race, class, and gender exert a lot of influence. Right? There was almost no literature about for-profit colleges as being part of that interconnected system. Right? Well, this troubles me for a lot of reasons. It troubles me because of where I was located in my research, and again, what my actual research question was. So my real research question here was, after I knew what we know about for-profit colleges, it was why for-profit colleges? Why in the new economy had almost all of the expansion in higher education happened in the market as opposed to public higher education? Because that's what we were facing. And that was a fundamentally different question than these things could answer, the first two theories can answer. They could tell us what, they could tell us how much, they could tell us labor market returns, they could tell us student characteristics, but they couldn't fundamentally answer why would people go there and to what ends. And for me, that was the real question, because if we understand that, maybe we don't reproduce the same social dynamic, right? Maybe we have some hope for doing some social policy interventions. Maybe social movements stand a chance of making things more fair. So to get at that issue, I started by talking to students. Talk to as many as one can do without a grant. That's that number you see there. we can talk about that later too. It basically involved me standing outside of for-profit colleges and trying to wave people down. Not the best method. I will tell you this, however, the area was carefully selected. This is fundamentally a case study. And used some other referral techniques. But yes, that's basically what that is. But then I wanted to focus on, this was important for me. Almost none of the literature had been done, none of the research had been done at for-profit colleges. Right? So we had sort of this neo-institutional view, this sort of all this stuff coming from our data, federal data sets, but very little sort of systematic research in for-profit colleges. So one of the first problems there is, one of the reasons why you see that is because it's almost impossible to do that research. Right? This becomes the catch-22. This brings us back to why it was important that I do that work. As luck would have had it, I had lived experience being inside for-profit colleges. That meant I could ask different types of questions based on that experience. And what I knew from both the literature and my experience was that the most important organizational feature in the for-profit college machine was the enrollment process. Right? So I start by wanting to get some systematic sense of whether the enrollment process at for-profit colleges was the same across institutions, the way it is in traditional higher education, roughly the same, right? Or if they had differentiated at all. That was a way of asking, is the way we enroll students, the way students find themselves into the river that produces students ready for a for-profit college, is that about them being for-profit? Or is it just about the institutional type, right? So I enrolled at 9 for-profit colleges over about the course of 9 months. You just keep showing up and you just keep enrolling. Or the more formal term, participant observation. Right? And then through a series of other processes, I interviewed 11 for-profit college executives, and I used executive deliberately. So what I was interested in was how were they interpreting how they had organized the business of their for-profit colleges to be compatible with what the reigning ideology was of what their colleges were supposed to be doing. Basically, how were they situating for-profit colleges within the ideology or the narrative of the skills gap, right? And how did they see the organizational processes intersecting with these broader things? Changes in how we work, changes in how we go to school. So that's the project. So now let's talk a little bit about what we kind of know, because this is important. So when we're talking about the for-profit college sector, I actually think it's fascinating. I've now been on this tour with the book for I don't know how long now. 6, 7 months. And at some point, people start to ask you, like, is there something you really, is there a question you really want me to ask you? And I'm like, yeah, at first I didn't have a question. I was like, yeah, no, ask me whatever you like. By about 3 or 4 months in, though, I got a little frustrated with the fact that what I had thought was one of the primary takeaways of my book, no one had asked me about. And this actually ties into, I think, Tessa's point on the panel earlier, which is everything you have ever heard about for-profit colleges is best understood through the lens of gender, right? 71% of students enrolled in for-profit colleges are women, right? This is a gender problem. And in fact, it was not until I started thinking about this as a gender problem that I started to think about more clearly the connections between how we credential and the macro conditions of the labor market, because that's really where it all is. Through gender, we start to see race and class differences as well. This is where they show up. But I think perhaps gender is the dominant lens, right? So African Americans, Hispanics, and poor people who are by definition low income are disproportionately enrolled in for-profit colleges. Again, I would look at that even through more so through the lens of gender. This is probably what is most precise to say. For-profit colleges are the credentialing organization for poor brown women who have children. It is, as one comedian once said in a clip that a student sent me, the college for baby mamas. So why is that, right? And what does it mean that that's what that type of credentialing organization does? A little bit more on that. This one is, the chart is actually the most recent data. The data points on the right were from the paper from Claudia and David and Lawrence Katz, putting a finer point on how race, class, and gender intersect with the enrollment patterns at for-profit institutions. So this is what we mean when we say overrepresented, right? That Hispanics are 15% of those in the for-profit sector as compared to 11.5% of all students, 13% for African American students as compared to 22%. And again, it was 65% in Deming's paper. The most recent one has it up. It tends to hover around 65 to 70% depending on the year that you run the data from iPads. I think there's a finer point to be put on that, though, and I'll run through it very quickly, and I have it based on the most recent iPads data. And that is this. African American women enrolled in graduate school, for-profit colleges are the #1 producer of African American women in graduate school and professional school. For-profit colleges are the #1 producer of African Americans with a bachelor's degree. That is over public institutions and historically black colleges, which is where we have been predominantly credentialed in the past. Of the top 10 Hispanics of the top 10 degree producers of Hispanics with bachelor's degrees, 6 of them are for-profit colleges. The gender rates the gender imbalances are most acute for women enrolled in 2-year or less degree programs, right? At the 2-year or less degree level, it's at 72%. Goes up to 60, goes down to 61% at the bachelor's and graduate degree level. Right. So this isn't just about for-profit colleges, but the differentiation within them. But at every level of the for-profit college sector, from certificate level, sub-baccalaureate certificates through graduate school, for-profit colleges are serving a student population that we have identified through the skills gap rhetoric, by the way, as being critical to us closing the quote-unquote skills gap in the economy. Right? You actually can't close a skills gap without credentialing and employing these people. Right? And they are disproportionately being credentialed in the for-profit college sector. That, to me, was the connection. Right. So I had a few questions about how the skills gap had made for-profit colleges a legitimate way to serve those students. Right? Again, had this been 1969, when we saw another sort of rapid expansion of the higher education sector, we would have built more community colleges, which is what we did at one time, right? We could have expanded public higher education. We could have expanded online public higher education. There were lots of options that we could have taken, but this became the dominant route for expanding access to people considered quote-unquote non-traditional or underrepresented in traditional higher education. So to look at that, I had to look at how higher education expansion was different than it had been in the past. One of the key differences was that it was happening in the market. It was a financialized process, right? Disproportionately, the growth happening in for-profit colleges colleges were happening among those that were publicly traded corporations. Right? So I looked at all of the Securities and Exchange Commission filings that were related with that, with the process of them becoming shareholder organizations, looked at marketing materials, state, federal, and consumer action case filings to look at how the states understood for-profit colleges being in violation of the job they were supposed to do, right? Because the only time the states and feds really care about for-profit colleges is when they think some fraud has occurred, right? So in the consumer actions against for-profit colleges, what I get a sense of is, when does the state think the for-profit college credentialing operation is a problem? Right? When is it okay and when is it a problem? All right. And so this is my takeaway. This is what I think lower ed is. Lower ed actually isn't just about for-profit colleges. That's a question I get a lot. From my perspective, lower ed is about a process. And this links into, again, I think the overall theme of today's symposium, which is that all of us are participating to some degree in lower ed, right? Mostly the difference is about what kind of institutional prestige we bring to that process, but all of us are engaged in it to some degree. Because lower ed is really ultimately about how structural changes in the way we work, right? Differential access to quote-unquote good jobs. I think, as Laura pointed out earlier, this is actually a real designation. We don't just mean good like a job you like. It means something. It is a job, for the most, that has good pay, right? Good living wage, the opportunity for promotion. There's an internal career ladder, right? And benefits. Health care, but increasingly also tuition assistance, right? And all of the things that basically go into having a stable lifestyle, right? So that's what we mean by a good job. So differential access to good jobs. And then I think one of the economists mentioned earlier, this is about who will pay for that. Who will pay for that, right? That all of this has happened in a logic legitimized by the idea of the skills gap that says the only people who are supposed to pay for that are workers themselves, right? And in fact, the ultimate way for this to work is for somebody to be able to profit from that process. That's what lower ed is, profiting from structural changes that social policy has not responded to in any better way, right? So I say that for-profit colleges, the best way to think about them is that they're a negative social insurance program, right? So we know what a social insurance program is. Anybody here a part of one that you know of? We all are. That's just to give it away, but yeah, that you know of. What do we mean by social insurance program? Anybody? Medicare, Medicaid, maybe? Anything else? Unemployment benefits. Unemployment benefits, UI if you've ever needed it, unemployment insurance, right? Social Security is the best one. Thank you. It's the best one. It is the best social policy, best as determined by it doing what it was supposed to do. It is the best social policy program that we have ever come up with in this country. And incidentally, that the student loan default system threatens to undermine. But that's something we'll get here to in a moment, right? So if that's a social insurance program, a negative social insurance program for me was that it is something that is providing a social function, right, but is not improving your quality of life, right? Because that's what all of those other social insurance programs do, right? They serve some function. Unemployment insurance is for when what happens? Income shock. You lose your job. You don't have any money. All right, so we say, well, that's not good, right? It's not just that it's not good for individuals, it's not good for families, and it's not good for communities, so we come up with this thing. What is Social Security supposed to do for people? If you live right, you are supposed to get old, right? And we have said that we can project fairly well that people will age, right? And so what we have said is, hey, it's good for people if old people are not sick and poor. All right, so these are things that provide a social benefit, right? All right, but we have also decided the other thing about those programs is that we communally pay into them, right? So we are basically sharing the risk for these things that have value. So a negative social insurance program is one where we share the risk, but there is not a positive benefit from it. So let's talk a little bit about risk, because I was thinking about it in this framework of what these other programs are supposed to offer. So at the same time that the skills gap was happening, we had these other sort of changes happening in how we would do social policy, right, or quality of life. So pensions at one time would provide some protection against, again, income shocks as you grew older. And we started to say, no, 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 no. What people need is more control over that money. So instead, we're going to come up with things like 401ks. They'll invest in themselves, and won't it be great? Won't you feel empowered, right? The other thing that happens, however, when you switch from pensions to empowerment of 401k is that the individual was assuming all the risk of subsidizing their old age income, right? They're taking all the risk of the market. The other thing we said was, let's talk about health care. Right? So we could provide standard group health care access, right? But instead we start to shift at the same time that this skills gap ideology is emerging. We start to say, no, it's really better and people have more control over their health care if they have these things where they can shop the market for the best prices, right? And save some pre-tax income, and won't that be great? People will feel awesome about that. As it turns out, people then also, however, absorb the risk of the cost of healthcare price differences. And then this happens. We start to say, listen, the skills gap says everybody needs to go to college, whether that's empirically true or not, by the way. Because to have a good job in the new economy, you have to have a credential. Right? The question would become, who would pay for it? Right. So we start to shift from the idea of internal labor markets, or that thing where you would work on the job and develop skills and then your employer would recognize them and then pay you more over your working life course. That used to be a thing. All right. So we start to replace that type of understanding of who would bear the risk of training for the good jobs of the new economy with the idea of, well, we've got a student loan system. Right? You can go out there and get a student loan and go back to school, right? Or if you're slightly better off, you can get something like a 529, these, again, pre-tax savings accounts that look exactly like the ones that we have for healthcare, right? The idea being, however, that if you're going to have to go to college off and on for the rest of your life, quote unquote, lifelong learning, you should do it in the market, and the market should provide you a mechanism to pay for it. So we've got these predictable collective social conditions. Right? And what we have said with the increase of the skills gap narrative is that there should be a market-based response to solve them. Yes, in the back.
Just a quick question. That last slide, did you also identify anything about, because I have this vague memory, it was roughly in the 90s somewhere, that the for-profit student loan business also started taking off, 80s, 90s range. Am I misremembering that?
There's always been a small, I mean, it's a very small market. What the for-profit student loan, I mean, they still exist, and you know, they're always out there. There's some hope that they will grow their market share with the, there's interest among lots of institutions to do these sort of income share agreements, these sort of different sort of student loan products. Here's the problem that that product has. It needs well-qualified people who can afford to pay the tuition to take them out. And I've not yet had anybody give me a reason why, if I could afford to pay my tuition, I would instead get a private student loan. Creditworthiness is an indicator like race, class, and gender, right? There's a very limited market for that, which actually we'll talk a little bit about more in a minute. All right. So all of this, right, incentivizes people to work harder, to compete for, to participate in this credentialing market, because we have said this is the singular path to a good job, which of course any sensible human being would want in an economy, right? The problem is not everyone is equally prepared to compete for those credentials. Right? So how, if everybody's hearing the same ideology, and this is one of the first things I got from my student interviews, is that across race, class, and gender, everyone had heard the ideology of the skills gap. Everyone. They talked about it in slightly different language, right? But everyone was aware of the fact that this thing was happening out there to them, and that they were individually responsible for solving that problem. The skills gap is actually one of the most successful sort of narratives that I've had the experience of reading about in sociological literature. It comes out of nowhere, right? And it really, I think there are lots of reasons for that, but it resonates with something that I think people were prepared to hear and to internalize. And they had across race, class, and gender. But so they hear the same ideology, go to college, right? But nothing about their backgrounds and preparation for college had changed. Right? If you had a negative experience of K through 12, you still had a negative experience of it. If you had a learning disability, you still had a learning disability. If you needed childcare, you still needed childcare. If you lived in an education desert that didn't have higher education options in close geography, you still lived in one of those. If you couldn't afford the transportation costs of commuting, you still couldn't afford those, right? So you had a mismatch between the ideology incentivizing people that the only way to have a good job in the economy was to compete in this very limited and specific way. And then you had changes in social policy to go along with that. Right? For the poorest students among us who have more interaction with means-tested social welfare programs, the other thing that had happened with the skills gap ideology was one of the ways those shifts happened was through the social policy that those people interacted with. So a little rarely discussed part of the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act, which we tend to think of as the Welfare to Work Act, right? This was a thing that was going to end welfare as we know it, and it kind of did, just not in a maybe good way. Was supposed to move people off welfare and into the labor market, which actually kind of made sense in 1996 if you know what the statistic, unemployment rates were at the time. The problem was 1996 was an anomaly, but whatever. But it said you had to be working to stay eligible for welfare benefits, right? Well, if you couldn't find a job, right, the other option for you to remain benefits eligible was to participate in an educational occupational training program. And by definition, the women that I spoke to in my study, the ones who had had some interaction with the welfare system, talked about accessing this system not as people pushing them to go to Georgia State. I was doing this field work in Atlanta, right? They were pushing them to go to the 6-month cosmetology program down the street, right? That's because the Educational Occupational Training Program exemption from the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Act did not allow you to take a degree program. It only allows you to do a workforce credentialing program. When you talk about who offers workforce credentials, you are literally building a social policy tunnel between the poorest students and for-profit colleges. Right? So to stay benefits eligible, disproportionately what women did, and these benefits eligibility was not just about welfare. For some of them, it was about keeping the vouchers for child care that they were using, their state and local child care vouchers that are tied to your means-tested qualification for welfare. So it was about staying eligible for your reduced daycare rates, right? And so they needed to stay certified for this process. And to do so, the fastest way to do that, and the way to be compliant with social policy, was to go to a for-profit college, right? That would qualify for one of these, that would qualify under that definition. None of this is a secret to the for-profit college industry itself, who understood that their market was not students who might be going to traditional higher education. Their students, as they told me, as several people told me, and as they've said in some of their SEC documents, they were competing with the military and the labor market. Right? They said, we're not even competing with other for-profit colleges. That's why we don't see each other as competition. Right? As David Paul Dean said in an interview, I've heard repeatedly from our admissions office that when they interview prospective students, they're saying they just lost their job or fear that they might lose their job. They know that the credentialing process they're offering is a direct response to labor market insecurities. Right? Politically, the response was, yes, that sounds wonderful. Right? I pick here on the GOP platform, but you've got pretty much the same language in the Democratic Party platform, which is we need new systems of learning to compete with traditional four-year schools. We need things like for-profit colleges because, does this sound familiar? They foster innovation, bring private industry into the credentialing market, and give students the ability to customize their college experience. Some of us have that same language on our brochures at our colleges and universities. Customize your degree program with us, right? We love this idea, right? Because if it can reduce the idea of higher education to a credential, well, that's a space that for-profit colleges can compete with us on, right? The students are trapped between what I call the education gospel, which one of the ways to think about that here today is the skills gap narrative, and how who they are constrains with their ability to go to college forever, as the labor market will increasingly require of all workers. Now, as you're all suitably depressed, let's talk a little bit about so what. Right? I think this is really important, that these things, when we talk about them, they, I always really like to make the point that we're talking about ourselves, right? So this is a link back the excesses of the for-profit college industry to now talk about those social processes and the problems. So part of the skills gap narrative and ideology is this idea of lifelong learning, right? The worker who will cycle through higher education credentialing intermittently now over their working life course. One of the problems is we don't have a system set up to pay for that, right? The student loan system is not set up for this. The student loan system was set up for you to get your credential, a credential, to exit the system and to never come back, right? We are all actually running afoul of that in the room, all right, right? So what? If it was just about for-profit colleges, I think I was speaking with a student, Ashley, this morning, right? This idea that, so what? We know about for-profit colleges. Yeah, we know we've got some predatory bad actors. What's the big deal, right? Well, if it was just about for-profit colleges, I mean, I would still have a problem because, again, they're credentialing lots of women and people of color and poor people, and I think that deserves our academic attention. But if it was just about for-profit colleges, they would be right. We would have a different set of, I think, urgency about the research. But what I argue is that this is not just about for-profit colleges. It is about the social function that for-profit colleges are serving, right? And that we cannot contain that forever among just the poorest among us, which is who for-profit colleges tend to capture. Oh, this cut me off there, Matt, right? We've got boot camps, micro-credentials, badges, right? We've got all these forms of a new credential, and we're all really trying to beta test to solve the same problem, right? How are we going to do this? What if it turns out that credentialing cannot do that? What if that's the problem? What if the problem isn't for-profit colleges, but that credentials cannot do that? So the real question becomes, how are we going to pay for higher education that the new economy demands? Well, that's a different question. And I think it is actually way more urgent than the question about for-profit colleges. So I'll talk a little bit about what I hope is hope, mostly because I do this I do a version of this kind of talk a lot, and I know it's very depressing. So I actually added these slides over the last couple of months because I got tired of everybody looking like this by the time I was done talking. So somebody made the point, the question, loved the question earlier, the difference between apprenticeships and internships, because I was like, hold that question for me, please, right? Because it is linked to what I really think is the larger issue. The thing that credentialing cannot solve is the decline of worker power and unionization. Right? It cannot solve that problem. What it has become is a stopgap solution for that problem. And I think that we're probably dangerously close to the outer limits of how well credentialing under our current system can solve that, right? So almost everything I have here is a social movement-oriented project, right? So Fight for Fit Team being some way to have occupational closure that does not involve people having to go to college. Point blank, we've got to have some vision for that. That, again, would be the difference between an internship and an apprenticeship. An apprenticeship, you don't have to be enrolled in college. An internship still hinges on you being a student. Much like trying to separate healthcare from your job, we think would make workers more mobile, what was this earlier point, right? Might help solve some of our spatial mismatch issues. Decoupling job occupational training from being a college student, as counterintuitive as that feels to higher education people, might be the best thing for higher education. Right? It means we produce fewer of these sort of questionable credentials for a labor market, I would point out this data, that does not show it values them very much. So here's the other takeaway. Students who do everything right, according to the education gospel and the skills gap, who go to college despite not having the means or the preparation to do so, and are more likely to go to institutions like for-profit colleges that seem to underprepare them for the labor market. The best case scenario is that they finish. By the way, that's not the likely scenario. The best case scenario, however, is that they finish, and when they do, this is what they find. They are more likely to be unemployed than those with the same student characteristics who graduated from a not-for-profit institution. When they are unemployed, they're unemployed for longer. We do not see a wage benefit to completing a for-profit college degree, even the most optimistic reading of that data, and people have cut it now 4 or 5 different ways with different methods. The most optimistic reading of that literature is this: well, it won't hurt your earnings. Right? There doesn't seem to be a positive effect, but at least the negative effect is not as big as we thought it was in some earlier papers, right? So do not seem to have a wage differential, and perhaps the worst case scenario for me is that with the high costs in student loan indebtedness, they have paid more for less when they had less to start with in the beginning. Really, that suggests that credentialing for them never should have been the option, right? Some of these other things probably should have been. So that's what I talk about in my work. As I'm turning to now is that I'm doing a comparative study to look at differences in rural and urban divides across the state of Virginia, where we're trying to look at how people understand the credentialing market that is becoming more and more differentiated, and how these social institutions that they have pre-existing relationships with shape their understanding of their choices. So if I've ever been on welfare, am I more likely to go to a for-profit college because that's what the people there talk about? As opposed to, well, what I got laid off from was a manufacturing job where nobody goes to school, and so instead I'm going to go do workforce development, get a certificate that I don't do a student loan for, right? How do those differences matter, and do they matter at all? One of my main takeaways, however, from doing this work is that we know very little about our modern credentialing market. Right, which is why I was very excited about the work that you're doing here at the Institute. To even get to some of my bigger questions, I had to start by just mapping the for-profit college universe. We didn't know basics like, how long does it take you to enroll? We didn't know what the application process was. There was nothing empirical about what the enrollment document said. Right? We have this burgeoning sort of area of credentials and very, very little empirical evidence of how they work and if they work at all. So some of the lessons from lower ed is that when we are not paying attention to that credentialing market, everything that's tested out at the margins diffuses back to traditional higher education. Right? We send out the ideology, those on the markets leverage it and profit from it, and then send the processes back to us, and we're expected to adopt them to become more efficient and business-like. And that's the loop we're caught in when we don't map what that market is and point out what the weaknesses are in the social processes that produce them. And I'll end there.
One of the other questions that I have, because I study for-profit institutions as well, is how to shape your research in a way in academia that they will be able to understand and respect it. And I think we kind of touched on that earlier this morning.
This is not my first time at the rodeo with that question, which is, and it's a difficult thing to have to say, especially as I stand in an education school building, which is part of our problem, I think, in the education research realm, is how uncritically accepting we can be of the ideologies that allow us to do the business that we do. As it turns out, the skills gap does legitimize certain forms of education research, right? So there isn't much of an incentive to critique what that ideology may be doing. If you are in the business of producing new credentials, frankly, the skills gap narrative is good for your business, at least in the short term. Right? And I do think there can be pushback then about critiquing some of those processes. Certainly not everywhere, but I certainly think they're in lots of those spaces. So it's about finding your right journals and your right colleagues, and looking beyond that. I mean, lots of people study education. I think there are plenty of critical economists and critical sociologists who do that work, critical anthropologists of education who are increasingly doing really fascinating qualitative work and important ethnographies that show us how some of these mechanisms of policy work in the real world. Anthropology of education is doing some amazingly fascinating work these days, work that I think we probably should have been doing in sociology, but we have some of the same problems as the education researchers politically.
I had not been paying attention to the detail in the 1996 law that you couldn't be earning a degree, it had to be a workforce thing. And I'm just wondering if you know what the politics were of that particular little tidbit.
You know what is so interesting to me, Pam? They were very honest about it. I'm blanking on his name now, but one of the chief economic architects behind the bill, I've got the quote on another presentation in a paper somewhere that I'm working on. I use it as an example. He says flat out, because we don't want people going to college on our dime. He said that was the reason, right? Yeah, that if you had to go to school, I mean, they wanted it, first of all, to be a last-ditch effort. And it was thought of, and they were designing it really to solve just a political negotiation problem, which more progressive states were saying, yeah, we kind of believe in, like, you know, people moving from welfare, obviously, to being self-sustaining, but, you know, how about giving them skills, especially if they're women and they had to stop out of the labor market because they're children. And so to solve the problem, because this was also part of moving this to the state block grant process, system, right? And so to solve that, the political solution was, okay, well, we'll allow some to go to school. But not 4 years, not a 4-year degree. It was, they say it very blatantly. And from the state's perspective, they wanted some of that fungibility, right? Because what we have seen happen with block grants is making that money fungible means they could use it if they can make it difficult for you to access the benefit. The money that people couldn't access becomes fungible in the state budgets. Right? So making it more difficult for people to qualify for the benefit was kind of the goal for some states. And so if you are in a place like I did, it's part of a paper that we're working on right now. So we're looking at this education desert issue, but through the lens of, yes, poor, especially poor female students, which is if you live in a more rural area where there is not a community college actually down the street or a branch of your local state college, the only option for you to go to school was the 2-year for-profit school down the street, Brookstone, ECPI, whatever. And our question about that was how many of those places were there, right? And whether or not that was shaping how people were accessing welfare benefits, et cetera. And what we found was that people were being sort of shunted into those programs to keep them from making an appeal for their welfare benefits. Right, so it becomes this sort of self-reinforcing loop. I don't think by design, but the way, you know, the incentives set up in that system are such. But yeah, they were very honest. They didn't want people getting what they think are useless degrees, liberalizing degrees on public money.
A hypothetical student coming from overseas, and he has this question. By the way, he comes from a country where he earned a college degree in science, heavy science, all free. He never paid a penny for his college education. And the degree was good enough that he was admitted for doctoral degree, even higher education, the highest education in this country. So since he works at pre and then postdoctoral degree level for under poverty wages while paying exorbitant tuition, his question would be, so what's the difference between a for-profit and non-for-profit higher education or lower education, whatever, institute of education in this country?
I get that one a lot, so I'm ready for it. Thank you. All right. So everywhere I go, somebody's got the, well, aren't we all for-profit now? Yes, yes. Okay, let's take it off the table. Yes, we are. Again, it is a set of social processes, and we're all enmeshed to a certain degree along this spectrum. The ideal college doesn't exist in the U.S., right? The ideal not-for-profit, which would be this one that is not participating in any market-based activities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It is a typology. It's an idea. Right? And at the far end, other end of the spectrum is a fully market-based institution or the for-profit college institution. So we're all mostly grouped somewhere in the middle. Some of us now starting to skew further to the right, which is another issue. But from the student perspective, this is about level of analysis. The student experience of how much they are paying to go to college and the fact that they're taking on high student loan debt, whether they go to a public institution or a for-profit institution, they are right. From their experience of paying for school, there is no difference, right? However, if our level of analysis is about outcomes, there is a vast difference between having a PhD from Wisconsin and a PhD from the University of Phoenix, which you can totally get, by the way, right? So there is a vast difference in the outcomes. So the return on your, and I hate using the investment language, but the return on your tuition dollars, right? There's a vast difference. So if I was looking at inputs versus outcomes versus loan indebtedness, it depends on what I'm looking at. Now, if I'm looking, however, at whether it matters at the group level or the societal level, that's a different level of analysis, because then that says that, yes, while we have shifted a lot of the risk of paying tuition to the individual student, it is still the case that that the public has invested to a certain degree in the publicly subsidized degree program, right? That does provide some other social benefit. The fact is, I can walk across this lovely campus today, and I don't think anybody's going to ask me for my identification, right? I'm not a poacher. I'm not lurking when I walk across the campus of a public college, right? We can set up a protest out front, and we might get in trouble, I think, for not having a permit, but, you know, there would be some sense that it's a public space, and that's what the public commons does. None of those things are true at the social level for the social function of for-profit colleges, which do not offer public space to communities, right? Do not offer a form of social movement or organizing or activism or citizenship development for the broader community. So at the social level, subsidizing both of those things the same way probably doesn't make a lot of sense. And while that doesn't help the student who has the high student loan debt, based on the sort of public subsidy of higher education, what we should expect back from those two sectors is probably quite different.
I would imagine that you have some critics or people who aren't happy with what your research has uncovered, probably mainly politicians and for-profit colleges. Have you had conversations with those folks about this research? And I'm just kind of curious what that looks like.
When I moved to Richmond, Virginia for my job, I don't think I realized how close it was to Washington, D.C., but people in Washington, D.C. realized it. And so I get lots of, and I'm gonna tell you, I became an academic on purpose, right? I do not want to be a politician. I do not even like driving into D.C. I mean, my gosh. But I have done it because I do feel a responsibility. As far as I know, I probably have as much interview data with any for-profit group of for-profit college students as anybody in the published research literature, and so I felt a responsibility to that. And as far as I knew, I was about the only person I knew who was making the argument about how were we going to peel away what public higher education should mean in this context, and so I thought that mattered. And people there read my book, and so they would contact me, and I do go up. I go to subcommittee hearings. I've met with congressional aides and other such things. I've been to the White House, the old White House, not the new one. I don't think I'll be invited back anytime soon. Yes, because I did feel a responsibility to the work and to try to do that if they were willing to ask. It's interesting. So here's what you're butting up against, I think, in DC land. Students are not empathetic constituents to most people, right? You took out $100,000 in student loan debt from a school, you're an idiot. That's what we believe, right? That's the narrative. We have a very hard time with our ideology of education as always a net positive, reconciling that with the idea that they are predatory forms of education. Some colleagues have this term predatory inclusion. They talk about the ways we systematically include people who have been underrepresented in the beneficial social processes. So how we include people in a market, how we include people in a beneficial institution like education while still being predatory. That's Louise Seamster and Renee Sharon. And I really like that framing because I think it gets at what is this contradiction we feel. Education can't be bad. There's no such thing. So politically, because you don't have an empathetic victim, there tends not to be a whole lot of urgency for dealing with what is fundamentally a very sticky political problem in the for-profit college sector. That is true in my experience of both Democrats and Republicans. They articulate it different ways, but neither one of them wants this issue. And I don't even think the Obama administration really wanted the issue. They got stuck with it because of their timing. But no one really likes it because you can't go out and tell most Americans who will never go to graduate school, who will never go to college, that we should somehow feel sorry for and subsidize the student loan debt of somebody who had this wonderful opportunity, right? It's a hard sell. So mostly I think their issues with my work have been that I make it, hopefully, and I hope this is true, I make it harder for them to pretend like this is an individual problem. Democrats have that problem with me as well as Republicans, which is why most of the meetings they have with me are off the record. So then the issue with for-profit college executives has actually been interesting. I mean, many of them I interviewed several times during the course of my research and still have open lines of communication with, and they knew the book was coming. I had been around a while, right? They kind of knew my shtick. All of them have read it. I get emails, you know, you don't understand how we're different. I get you, buddy, I know. If you would just come talk to our students, they'd love it here. I get it, I say to them. I say, but customer satisfaction is not my outcome interest. It's not. You can be satisfied with Cheese Whiz. That doesn't mean we should subsidize it and give everybody Cheese Whiz. I just realized I'm in Wisconsin and made a cheese joke. That plays better, and that would have played better somewhere else. But anyway, right? There are all kinds of things that people are satisfied with, but that is not the metric. I think someone said earlier when we use this bad data sometimes from employee surveys, right? The customer satisfaction surveys among college students are the same sort of thing, right? These really poor instruments designed for vastly different purposes in social science knowledge, and they want to tell me our students are 97% satisfied. I don't care. Right? It's not the point. But they've read it and they have issues, but they mostly think and hope, and I think they unfortunately may be right. They know that the political winds are not at my back. It's at theirs. And so most of their issues with me have been about the fact that I won't say that they're different. Right? That, yeah. We know there's some for-profit colleges like that, but we're different. And if you would just come here and tell people how we're different, right, this would be good. But, you know, none of that, fortunately, has any bearing whatsoever of me being a good academic. And for that, I'm very fortunate for my job.
There's been some of a movement to improve or change the quality of the K-12 credential of the high school diploma, both through the movement to create high school exit exams,
yes,
and more recently states adopting these, like, you can get a STEM badge, honors sort of certificate on your high school diploma. Can you just talk a bit about how that movement and those types of policies fit with your analysis, because that is still state subsidized?
The earlier data were interesting, not totally surprising to me, but interesting for this, you know, the part of the critique of the college for all rhetoric is that, no, we just need to make a high school degree matter more, right? If a high school degree would embrace what we need kids who can code, right? We need kids who can work machine, right? And if we would just do that, like someone else said, we've been saying that for at least 100 years. That's been true for a very long time. The idea that you can have, I think, a perfect match between a high school diploma and labor market needs is probably asking the wrong question of what K through 12 preparation is supposed to do. As long as it is K through 12 is still compulsory, there is no reason why we should have a perfect match to the labor market. It doesn't make any sense. We make people go to high school and middle school, right? The reason why we can ask these things of higher education is precisely because theoretically you elect to be there. We don't have that in K through 12. Having said that, yes, the inequalities in K through 12, so the tracking within and between schools in K through 12 are part of the reason why we have the unequal preparation for higher education, so that when workers do find themselves in need of a post-secondary credential, they are not equally prepared to pursue one. But that assumes, this goes back to my earlier point, that we assume that's a technical problem. What we have argued in social education is that that's not a technical problem. That is precisely how we want K through 12 to work. as a society. And in fact, if you try to make K through 12 equal, the first constituency at your door is going to be angry parents. You actually, I mean, you know, so, and we know that. So yes, ideally, if this again were a technical problem, we would absolutely equally prepare all students for higher education. And many of us want that, but that's certainly not a problem that end of year test and testing testing for graduation is going to solve. Now, there are some states, my home state, for example, the state of North Carolina, research that shows you can complete the basic high school graduation curriculum and not be qualified for admission to the state flagship university. Right? And we call it, you know, this mismatch between the high school curriculum and the college curriculum. I do think probably at the state level, there's a very good argument for closing that gap. At the federal level, it doesn't make any sense to me at all.
I'm thinking about the loop that you mentioned of the messaging of the for-profit sector leaking into infiltrating the broader discourse about higher ed. And my question is, do nonprofit institutions, however we're defining them or what that distinction is, do they have things to learn from the for-profit sector about the recruitment and retention of students, especially women, poor women, women of color? And then outside the walls of the university, do nonprofit institutions have good lessons to learn about doing advocacy, outreach, and politics?
I've got different versions. The book, you know, there are 3 different levels of analysis in my book. I've got the students, I've got the institutions themselves, and the macro conditions. And I focus mostly on macro for this talk today because we were talking about the skills gap issue. But to answer your question, I'm going to now focus on the organizational data and the student interview data. Just to tell you that I know I didn't touch on that here. It would be a 2-hour presentation and nobody wants that. So, and it's a question I get a lot, and took very seriously actually when I was doing this work. I think I told some people earlier, I did a thought experiment for 6 months at one time about how to create a good for-profit college, right? Because I was trying to work my way back to what the theoretical mechanisms were for producing a bad one. So I had to start with what would be a good one. And what you end up with is a good for-profit college is a public college. Now, having said that, but that is not, so it's not to say that the profit itself, may not be the problem. It is part of the set of stuff that it sets into place and constraints, et cetera. But the things that they have learned to do well in the pursuit of profit could be good lessons if we were not doing them to pursue profit. But here's our problem. It is the pursuit of profit that allows them to spend the money in ways that we cannot do in the not-for-profit sector. And it becomes this really depressing, I think, catch-22, and I'll explain how based on some of the data. So when I go out and I apply at 9 colleges, right, that's what I'm trying to understand, the admissions mechanism. What is their preferred organizational fuel? Who is their assumed student, right? By the way, I think one of the great weaknesses of my work is, again, I was working as a solo researcher. I was a black woman doing this. I was their ideal student. I think you probably get a vastly different set of data if you have different people doing that research, and I would love it if someone ever pulls that off. But no, so you go in, and this is what I learned. The enrollment process on average at those 9 for-profit schools, I could go from my first point of contact with the school, meaning I picked up the phone and dialed that 1-800 number, or I filled out that online form that comes up when you're trying to buy shoes, right? How fast from that first point of contact to the first opportunity to become an enrolled student? That was what I was trying to get. So how long, when I'm interested in coming to this UW campus, how long from the first point of contact to the day I become an enrolled student? And I had some people in the room from tech schools, so by design that should be shorter. So how about from some technical colleges? About how long?
Probably a few weeks to a month.
A few weeks to a month. All right. On average for me at for-profit college, it was 4.5 days. Right. So the very first thing that we probably could learn from them is it is very important for students who have had a negative or non-experience with an institution of higher learning to become legally affiliated with the institution as quickly as possible. It solves lots of problems for poor people, non-traditional students, working women, working class women, mothers. Some of the problems that solves. If I can only get out of my second shift job and tell them I need a first shift job so that I can get my kids from daycare before they start charging me extra fees, the only way they'll do that is say, you gotta have me some proof that you're in school or something, you need the shift change. Well, as it turns out, if I go down the street to Strayer, I could have that proof in a few days. right? Or maybe I need certification that I'm a good parent because I'm in the CPS system, all right, Child Protective Service system, and I have some interaction with some agency that has some authority over me or my children or my well-being, and I need to demonstrate that I'm doing certain things, right? Being enrolled quickly might help me facilitate those other parts of my life. Or maybe I'm trying to get things lined up in a very complex life where if one thing goes off the rails, right, the whole house of cards falls down. My child care, my transportation, my work schedule, trying to project out. One of the things that we know about dancing along the line of work and poverty is how complex that decision making is. When I'm trying to project 9 months out, or even a month out, every day of delay is a day when something can undermine my plans. So being affiliated with the institution as quickly as possible is a huge benefit. The other reason why that's a huge benefit is that changes when the institution can start spending money on you, right? So the way we're set up is colleges and not-for-profit colleges and universities do a lot for our students, right? The entire point is to sort of wrap our arms around them, right? But that's only once they become students. We don't do that for prospective students, and frankly, we couldn't. That's not, we get in trouble if we did. First of all, you run afoul, most of us, of our public charter, right? We can only start to provide all of those support services that poor students need the most when they become students. A month-long process, a 9-month process to get all of the help you need makes you vulnerable, I think, to other institutions who say, hey, we can do it for you in 5 or 6 days. So one of the things, and this is a very difficult issue because we are constrained by accreditation, charters, norms, culture, et cetera, though it's maybe thinking about how we reallocate front-load resources in an institution to take the most care of a student at the point of handoff when they become enrolled. We know that. That's not a new finding. We also know what the constraints are to us doing it, but there you have it. But that's why the programs like the one-stop ASAP and one-stop programs, et cetera, are so successful, I think, with those types of students, is basically just trying to do that. At the more sort of concrete level, I really think one of my for me personally, surprising findings was how intimidated and upset people were with IVR systems. You know, the phone where you call and it says press 1 for, press 3 to get to press 4. Where this is just a logical outcome of us being complex bureaucracies, right? We have one number and then you need to press 5 different other numbers to get to the right person. I cannot tell you how frequently it came up in interviews with students that them not having to do that at the for-profit college mattered so much to their decision making. I actually encourage all of you. You are in this system. I encourage you to call a for-profit college sometime over the next week. Call one of those 1-800 numbers and see what happens. See how much you like it or don't like it. Costs you nothing. Block your phone number when you do it. That's my tip. But seriously, unless you want them calling you back forever, but call in and see how different it is. Something that we think of as a bureaucratic process is for a lot of students a barrier, mostly because of the institutional knowledge they need to successfully navigate that IVR. What is the difference between admissions and enrollment? Financial aid and scholarships. Testing and advising. Placement. Oh dear God, I don't even know. I barely know what placement is, right? But that's the kind of knowledge you need to navigate that system. When you call the 1-800 number at a for-profit college, a human being answers the phone. And that mattered a lot for lots of prospective students. So I think maybe some of our takeaways are shifting the resources to the front, probably making our jobs more difficult to make access more enjoyable for prospective students, and thinking of prospective students as more student than prospect.